The test went good, so I think we can start. And I invited the speakers of this session to join me at the table. So please, we have arranged the positions for almost all of you. Anna è qua, Giuseppe, Kieran, and Corrado. So we are now going to start the last segment of this conference. Just a few minutes to remind you of the design of this conference. So yesterday we had the first session, the introductory session, in which the, let's say, theoretical, conceptual challenges of vulnerability in a time of human rights regression and so on were tackled by the speakers. Yesterday afternoon, the topic has been expanded in a series of panels in which, many aspects of the vulnerability/human rights topic has been addressed from very diverse angles and perspectives. And now, this is the last moment of our conference in which we try to go a little more practical and present you, not the theoretical frame again, or other discussions about what is the concept of vulnerability, which are ontological or situational vulnerability and so on, but present you with some examples, some stories perhaps, some also challenges and questions for you. And to do so, we have a wonderful panel of practitioners, academics, experts, activists that all the day and every day handle situations in which vulnerable people are implicated, in which they have to respond to the vulnerability of a certain variety of situations and populations. So starting from my right hand, we have Pier Giuseppe. Sorry, I have to check my notes. I know Pier Giuseppe by name and also by, let's say, its academic expertise. But I don't remember his Parisi, okay, Pier Giuseppe Parisi, sorry, it was a little of suspense, from the University of York. Then coming closer to me, Anna Brambilla, she's a lawyer. She collaborates with the ASGI Association of lawyers in Italy that deal with migration issues. Then Kira Hassan, that you also met, some of you met also in the panel yesterday, from the University of London. I will introduce each of them a little more later. And then Corrado Mandrioli, finally, Vice President of an Italian NGO, Rescue, that deals with rescue of people. Okay, in the Mediterranean, people saving peoples, yeah. So the idea this morning is to listen to them. They will present briefly what they have done, what they are doing in the field of dealing with vulnerability, practically dealing with vulnerability cases, vulnerability situations. From, working as academics, working as lawyers, as academics and experts in media, with a specific focus on situations of natural disasters, so-called natural disasters, and activists and operators in an NGO. Online, we will be reached in a few minutes, I hope, by the fifth presenter of this panel, who is Alexander Rosinski. He's an officer working for OCHA in this moment, located and working with displaced people in South Sudan. I don't know if he's already online. He announced to me that he's probably had some technical problems to get the connection. He's in South Sudan right now. By probably 10:30, he will, virtually join us online. So the first speaker, according to the program, and let's see if we have maybe to postpone the intervention by Alexander. The first speaker for today is Anna Brambilla. As I told you, she is a lawyer, she's a practitioner in Italy, and her area of work is the rights of migrants. And yeah, the idea for the panel is to have first a presentation of, let's say, 15 minutes. Each of them will present their main issues. Then hopefully there might be some, let's say, a response from the members of the panel to what they listen to from their colleagues. So 5 minutes, let's say, echoing what has been said, responding to some challenges, questions that we have raised. And this would take, let's say, 1.5 hours. We hope to have some minutes also to take some questions from the audience and respond to you, to open up a little bit the discussion. So, Anna, the floor is yours.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much for this invitation. And okay, yes, I'm a lawyer, and I'm involved in this association, ASGI, Association for Juridical Studies on Immigration, and specifically I'm involved in a project called Medea, and we work on internal border and on the Balkan route. Today, I would like to focus on some specific cases of vulnerable person or person who became vulnerable meeting the system. So the aim of my speech is to highlight not only how much vulnerability is a shifting notion, but also how some vulnerabilities are completely invisible, even if there are tools and rules of protection. I will try to focus on 2 or 3 cases. I have to see the time. And for each one of them, I will start with some keywords, like to focus on which type of vulnerabilities. So the first one is unaccompanied minor, secondary movement, and vulnerability. Youssef is a young unaccompanied, is a young Sudanese national. Okay, he born in Darfur, and but he grew up in Libya, because when he was 2 years old, his family moved from Sudan, from Darfur to Libya. So he grew up in Libya. And in 2018, he decided to flee. He has to flee from Libya, and he arrived in Italy. He decided to try to reach Germany, so he moved from the south of Italy and he arrived in Ventimiglia. He tried several times to cross the border between Italy and France, and at the end he reached Germany. But when he arrived in Germany, he's identified as an adult, not as an unaccompanied minors, as a minors. So for that reason, German authorities start a Dublin procedure. They want to send him back to Italy, but at the end, he received a birth certificate. And so for that reason, the asylum procedure starts in Germany. But after 1 year, he received a negative decision, even if he was from Sudan, he was from Darfur. And it's really interesting because it's not so usual, but I received the decision from the German authorities, and it's really interesting to read why he received a negative decision. The German authorities' decision states that any persecution suffered in a third country, in that case in Libya, is irrelevant for the refugee status, and that even if Sudan is one of the poorest and most indebted countries in the world, a difficult economic situation cannot justify a ban on expulsion. So not a protection, but a ban on expulsion. And again, according to German authorities, taking into account the general condition in Sudan, it can be reasonably be expected that the applicant will be able to live in Khartoum and meet their his minimum needs. The applicant can look forward to living as a healthy young man of working age, even without family support. it is not understood why the applicant should not be able to find a job after returning to Sudan. So Youssef received this negative decision, and his accommodation reception measures are reduced, so he decided to move again from Germany to Italy. He arrived in Italy and he asked again for protection, but he received a Dublin decision transfer to Germany because of the previous negative decision in Germany. And he made an appeal against this transfer decision, but this was 2022, but he is again waiting for a decision on the appeal. Because of the European, we are waiting for the decision of the European Court of Justice. It's a long story, but he's waiting and waiting and waiting. He cannot understand why. This is the first case. The second case, the keywords are denial of access to international protection, social exclusion, secondary movement, again, mental illness and criminalization. Kamel, he's a Palestinian, he born in Gaza, but at the age of 5, again, he moved from Palestine to Libya, and he is not school, he can neither read or write in Arabic, so he's a very poor background. And in 2011, he left Libya and he arrived in Italy. At the arrival, on the arrival, after the disembarkation, Kamel received no legal information, no information on the possibility to ask for international protection, and the Italian authorities notified an expulsion order. So for almost 2 years, he lived in the street, and after he decided to move in Germany, but once more time, Germany gave to him a transfer order to Italy. He came back to Italy, he again live in the street, developing also an addiction to drugs and alcohol. In 2016, he was arrested for theft. And in 2018, he reached Bolzano, near the Italian-Austrian border. And at the end, he found someone who helped him, also giving a legal support. And he tried several times to ask for international protection to the immigration office in Bolzano, but immigration office in Bolzano refuses his application because he is without accommodation, because he has criminal records, and so on and so on. At the end, he also tried to commit suicide, and a lawyer presented an urgent appeal, and the judge ordered to the immigration office to receive his asylum application. But what happened? That the Territorial Commission for International Protection of Verona refused the asylum application, gave to Kamal a manifestly considered the asylum application of Kamal as a manifestly unfounded asylum application due to the time that he's waiting for ask for asylum. Last, I will be short because I don't know if I have again time, but the keywords female unaccompanied and minor, so a classic example of vulnerable, victim of sexual abuses, invisibility, secondary movement, vulnerability. This case arrived in front of the European Court of Human Rights, and we receive first interim measures from the court, and at the end, after 6 years, also a decision on the merit, and Italy has been considered that there is a violation of Article 3 of the European Convention of Human Rights. M is, I cannot say the name, but M is a female. He arrived at 16 years old in Italy, and initially he was in the south of Italy in a very bad condition of accommodation. So at the end, he decided to move, and he arrived in Como, where she has been accommodated in an adult center, accommodation center in Como. And even if for a lot of time, she explained that she was a victim of sexual abuses, that she needed protection, Italian authorities ignore her position, and at the end, we had to ask for interim measures to transfer M in a specific accommodation facilities for unaccompanied minors. So what this case demonstrates, I think that vulnerability can exist from the beginning, is true in all these cases, and that vulnerability can be a condition requiring special protection. Vulnerability can be a condition that corresponds to categories, legal standards, but in the end, the vulnerability in most of cases remains invisible and is worsening, yes, by the system. For instance, Youssef was an unaccompanied minor, and therefore he needed protection, but at the beginning he was strong enough to face a migratory journey. His vulnerability, the main reason of his pain, mainly is determined by negative responses by the system. Now, he is really vulnerable, but now, not at the beginning. And also, Kamel, it's true that he was a person with a poor background, but his mental problems stemmed from his exclusion from the system. At the beginning, he was safe. At the beginning, he was in a quite well situation, yes. And also M was a victim, sure, of sexual abuses, but she was also a young woman with a strong desire of self-determination, and she decided to flee because she was tired to wait. So sometimes I think that we have to think about our position also in this system, in which way also we produce vulnerability, using in which way we have to use these categories with these tools to not worsen the vulnerability of a person. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think this is our task in this panel, to present the audience with challenges also, situations that call for a response, a theoretical response, a sort of response from, that requires people to let's say, to reason out and also to resonate maybe with the situations that we are presented with. A response that can come from the panel, from the experts, let's say, from those who are already working in the field, but also from the audience, from the public. The second speaker is Pier Giuseppe Parisi. Pier Giuseppe works in the University of York in a center that deals with practical issues concerning human rights. I know that his expertise is about indigenous peoples, but also the situation of activists, human rights defenders working in some specific areas. So you have the floor again.
Right. Thank you very much and good morning, everyone. First of all, let me begin by thanking the organizers for inviting me and also to say that I genuinely had a great time yesterday in the 2 panel sessions that I attended. And I learned a lot from colleagues from all over the world. So I'm very thankful for that. So like everyone else on this panel, I was asked to talk a little bit about vulnerability in an age of human rights regression from an action-oriented perspective. And I must say that at the beginning, I panicked a little. I'm an academic, so I thought, what am I going to say that is practice-oriented? But then I thought immediately about my immediate community of practice, so academics and researchers, right? And I think that in the predominant collective imagination, academia and academics are often regarded as a bit removed from practice. We read books, journal articles, sometimes we conduct interviews with practitioners, state officials, victims of human rights violations, charitable organizations, but we still approach what we study in a bit of an aseptic way, in the predominant imagination, that is. But I do think that academia and academics, especially human rights scholars, can and do have a responsibility to get muddied, to walk alongside our research participants and partners, to politicize our research, especially when we interact with so-called vulnerable subjects or communities. And I hope that by the end of what I'm going to say, you'll also understand why I've just added so-called. So I thought maybe I can offer some reflections addressed to both academics, but more generally researchers and academic institutions, as well as to research partners or participants that identify as vulnerable, in particular on the ethics of conducting research with vulnerable individuals and communities, which is basically what I've been thinking about throughout the past few years. And to do that, I will reflect a little bit on my own experience working with human rights defenders and an indigenous community in Colombia. And obviously, please forgive me if some of these reflections seem a bit unstructured. It's still a bit of a work in progress. So let me begin from indigenous communities with whom I've been working for the past year and a half. And I'll mostly refer here to the situation of the indigenous community I collaborate with, which is a NASA indigenous community in Colombia, though obviously similar considerations would apply to other indigenous communities in Colombia, Latin America, but all over the world, really. I think that no one would deny that they qualify as a vulnerable community, like many other indigenous peoples in the country, often caught in the crossfire between guerrilla groups, paramilitaries, and the national armed forces, sometimes far removed from basic service, including health service providers, economically marginalized, and not infrequently stigmatized by both state and non-state actors. They continue to fall victims of multiple forms of violence. And the response of the state often brings further violence. State-provided individual protection schemes often include the deployment of non-indigenous protection officers carrying firearms, as well as the assignment of protection devices, such as bulletproof jackets, that make the beneficiary of the protection schemes more recognizable. Collective protection schemes are often culturally inadequate, as they don't provide for funding to support spiritual practices that, according to the NASA cosmovision, protect them. And moreover, state armed forces respond to the presence of illegal armed groups with further militarization of the territory, which brings more violence and instability. So I think we can see very clearly how these responses to vulnerability not only fail to mitigate, but they often increase vulnerability. But let me go back to us, academics. What is the role of academia in this context? Academia is often consciously or less consciously complicit in perpetuating the conditions that make indigenous peoples vulnerable. From extractive research practices through forms of abuse against indigenous researchers or partners to disingenuous, essentialist descriptions of indigenous peoples, these communities are often treated as the object of research. I think we've heard some of these problems yesterday in the panel on vulnerability and the ecosystem. A few NASA indigenous elders told me that the story of a team of university researchers coming into their communities to gather data about land conflicts in the area, only to then publicly back local sugarcane farmers with whom conflict over land was ongoing. Most recently, allegations of physical and psychological abuse against indigenous persons by university researchers have popped up in the press, not only in Colombia, but all over the world. Traditional practices, such as rituals, which belong to the collective intimacy of indigenous communities, are often dissected in academic outlets without having obtained the prior and informed consent of those communities, or without regard to the consequences for the integrity of the interested communities. These practices disempower indigenous communities. They deprive them of their agency and ownership over their own struggles and resistance processes. By essentializing and dissecting their way of life, they objectify indigenous peoples. They generate forms of dependency, and instead of addressing vulnerability, they engender new forms of vulnerability by exposing indigenous communities and individuals to re-victimization. And most importantly, they reproduce or reinforce the root causes that lead to victimization. Then the question is, what should we do? What are our responsibilities? I think that we need to first go back to the notion of vulnerability. We often say that certain groups or individuals are vulnerable because of the circumstances they find themselves in. But we've heard yesterday, vulnerability is also intrinsic or ontological to the human condition. There is no such thing as invulnerability, as legal theorist Martha Feynman posited. And the counterpoint to vulnerability, she continues, is resilience. And resilience is constructed, and I would add, interdependent. For example, it is now clear that conservation policies and development models that value indigenous knowledge and understanding of the relationship between the human being and nature have the potential to be, and in some cases have indeed been, more successful in protecting the environment than state-driven solutions. And we've been reminded yesterday about the urgency to tackle the global environmental crisis by adopting radical solutions that uproot the predominant institutions and socioeconomic models. I guess what I'm trying to say is that there is strength in being vulnerable. Vulnerability doesn't annul resilience. On the contrary, it generates new forms of resilience. And I think that is precisely one of the actions that academics and academia should undertake. We need to recognize indigenous peoples, but more generally vulnerable people and communities as, let me use a bit of a literary expression, masters of their own destiny. We need to understand that we can learn from resilient practices that emerge from contexts of vulnerability. But how do we do that? I think that the key is to dismantle existing research paradigms and disrupt the power relationships that inevitably define our interactions with research participants and partners in relation to access to funding, soundness of research methodologies, academic measurement indexes, etc. But let me focus on methodologies. I think much wisdom comes precisely from contexts where academia has had to confront difficult questions around the relevance of academic research and outputs and the relationship with vulnerable communities. In my own practice, I refer in particular to the idea of participatory action research, which comes from a Latin American tradition that, broadly speaking, can be traced back to the works of Paulo Freire in Brazil and Orlando Falsborda in Colombia. That is an idea of research that has the potential to transform practice and is capable of generating knowledge that is locally and publicly relevant. It requires inverting the process by which research questions are generated, not by academics, but by research participants. It also requires incorporating in our practice methodologies that we don't generally find in academic research methods manuals. With a few exceptions, of course, and I'd like here to mention the work of Linda Tuhiwai-Smith on decolonizing methodologies, which has been an inspiration for me. But more fundamentally, I think it requires understanding that there are other epistemologies, even though I like better the word cosmovision. I think yesterday in one of the panels, we had a debate around the word science and how indigenous peoples are increasingly reclaiming it to describe their own way of knowing. And the same thing could be said of many other terms. Think about medicine and the relationship with traditional medicine. Clearly, language and terminology are also fundamental. This was mentioned yesterday during the same panel on vulnerability and the ecosystem. Recently, in a workshop at my university, while describing my research with indigenous peoples in Colombia, I was asked whether I intended for my research to be collaborative or participative, given that I had used the two words interchangeably. How naive of me. Huh? So that's what led me to go back to the works of Freire and Falsborda. And that leads me to another important point, which is that so much of this local knowledge is lost in translation. This speaks to the global power imbalances in academia. English academic outlets are still dominant. Publishing in these journals or having access to them is often simply too expensive. And in fact, one of the key asks of some of the defenders that we host at the Center for Applied Human Rights, where I work, is precisely to retain access to the library of the university once their fellowship with us comes to an end. In short, I think that our primary responsibility as academics is to recognize the existence of these power imbalances, to recognize that we are part of the problem and that we can reinforce or even generate new forms of vulnerability. And if we want to make a step further, I think we need to try and rectify this situation by letting go of our power, to recognize the agency of vulnerable individuals and communities by letting them set the research agenda and define the best methodology to achieve research objectives. And ultimately, we need to recognize that our resilience is intertwined with their resilience and that there is a great deal that we can learn from them. Thank you.
I told you we had a wonderful panel. And thank you for raising these extremely important questions. I mean, the epistemological dimension of vulnerability and violence. You know, the hard sciences take a sample, dissect the sample, and destroy the sample. Are we going to do the same in social sciences? Okay. I want to ask some news about Alexander. If he's online, no, he couldn't manage so far. So we skip for the moment Alexander from South Sudan, and this means that the next speaker is Kiran Hassan. She has been busy as a researcher and also as a consultant, activist, advisor in many issues, in many contexts, including the issue of disasters, national disasters, and how media can communicate these disasters, how media can be unfair in talking about the vulnerability of some category of people. So Kira, you have the floor. I think you have a presentation.
Thank you.
That can be shown now.
Thank you so much. I need to have that gadget.
The remote?
Yes.
Okay.
Sorry.
Excellent.
Thank you so much for asking me to be presenting at this very prestigious academic platform. I'm delighted. Thank you to all the organizers. Today, I'm going to be not talking about vulnerability, but I'm going to be speaking about a case study that I have been involved in for the past 12 years. This is something that I stumbled upon when I was doing my PhD in mass communication. I will start my presentation with a figure that I came across in United Nations Children's Fund leaflet in 2023 March. And according to that leaflet, there are 4 million Pakistani children fighting for survival near contaminated and stagnant flood waters, and 27,000 schools have been washed away. In the same report, this was written that while the rains have ended, to a great degree, so has the media attention. I have several questions to the global and local mainstream media. Why is this humanitarian crisis not reported in the media? Where are the voices of the most affected? Why does the climate disaster coverage only survive if it has political or corporate incentives? Is the acute humanitarian crisis story being hijacked by loss and damage debate in COP27 and COP28 meetings? So my entire kind of case study is going to be looking at the role of the media in how it just does not cover well or enough the victimization of flood victims in the global South. And while we talk about climate change and climate crises, the media has a huge responsibility in covering that story well and enough. So just to give you a bit of a heads up, floods in Pakistan it's been a kind of, it's historically, the Indus Valley has been prone to flood repeatedly. And there have been 67 reported flooding events in Pakistan occurring since 1900, where 52 of them were of significant severity in the last 30 to 40 years. We also have, according to the International Disaster Database, some of these events happened to such large scale in the 1950s, 1973, 1976, 1977, 1992, 2001, 2007, and 2008. I myself I was stumbled upon to look at the 2010 floods, which were devastating in its scale, but less than so if you compare it to 2022. So Pakistan experienced floods that affected 20 million people in 78 districts, killing almost 1,800 people and damaging and destroying about 2 million homes at the time. More recently, there was some coverage in the mainstream Western media. In 2022, we had floods which affected 33 million people, killing almost 1,800 people, and 8 million displacing people now facing health crises. I gave a paper on the communication strategies of these flood victims in 2010 in Bassas conference and University of Southampton. And I was made fun of by all the kind of academics. This was a paper which people thought was not relevant at all because it was talking about climate crises and media strategies to actually handle climate crises. And I was begging for some kind of funding from various institutions, and there was no attraction or appeal for this kind of proposal. Eventually, I got lucky with Heinrich Wolf Stiftung Foundation, and they gave me some funding, and they published this leaflet in which I gave some policy recommendations on how to actually have some kind of positive media communication strategies for flood victims. At the same time, I came across this world conference which happened in December 2010 on natural disaster reduction and the Round-Table on media, which offered guidelines for how could media be more responsible in providing coverage to the climate stories. Surprisingly enough, the kind of recommendations policy recommendations that I've actually incorporated in this work of mine correlates with what was the kind of recommendations at that World Conference, which is the media had the responsibility to warn the foreseeable affected communities to prepare before and during the disaster. The media should gather and transmit accurate information. The media should alert affected communities about relief organizations. The media should share effective ways of saving lives, reducing damage to the affected public during the disaster. Unfortunately, neither the World December Roundtable Conference's recommendations were undertaken, nor was this book. I think it's some useless document because this was not really taken up. It was not given any kind of credence, which comes back to the same disaster happening at a biblical kind of in a massive level in floods 2022. And all this kind of like massive, by this time, everybody was interested in the climate story, how the climate change is happening. I mean, it was all around the COP27. It's fashionable to talk about climate crises. It's talk about, we are all for climate change. Let's just do that. But still the media fails to actually fill into the voice of the communities who are the most affected. And I would talk about the Pakistani mainstream media's fault in how they covered. Again, really, they had a faulty coverage for the affected people. So the flood story in 2022 was covered too little, too late, because the mainstream media was covering Imran Khan's jalsas, protest march. There is like a war of rating for television channels. There is lack of resources, equipment, and journalistic expertise to cover the flood story. So there is a huge kind of infrastructure problems, both not only in Pakistan, but my colleagues in India, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka face the same issues because mainstream media organizations have lack of resources to actually cover these kind of communities, and the interest is not there. I observed sporadic and staged reporting, which I also in 2010, which had massive political incentives at the back. And then there was, again, little to no coverage of the flood story in the post-construction phase. There is no appetite for follow-ups or interest in follow-ups, where that is the most critical kind of stage to look at that story and talk about that story. The challenges, mainstream global media faces this challenge that to cover the climate story, you have media's challenges to cover the climate stories have been enormous. Globally, how can this story be offered without corporate benefits or political incentives or both? And there is a kind of strong anti-climate lobby, which does not really provide enough space to talk about the sufferings of these victims. And they're also hugely well-connected and influential. So media is one of the most powerful tools of information and for collaboration, for influence. And this has been not a part of the kind of interest of the local or the global media. There is also a challenge, which is how to present the story without causing consistent communal fear. Communication specialists always argue that we have to really go a bit easy on the climate story because we don't want to be the fear mongers for the audience and it's bad for the audience consumption patterns. In Pakistan, there is a consistent lack of interest to cover this story. And I've observed in my 12 years of research that it is only picked up when either there is a politicized, there is it for political kind of, elevation for the local, power brokers, or to just, attract the international donor community. There is no, sense of actually doing something for the flood victims. And this problem over the years have actually ballooned in front of my eyes. So I'll give you some interesting kind of like examples. So this was this article is more than 12 years old. When 2010 floods happened, President Zardari at that time was on his UK tour. He was not at all bothered with the flood devastation that I've talked about, and he was just touring the UK. Well, he was giving a presentation in Birmingham. There was a man who threw a shoe at him, and that was reported not only first in the kind of UK newspapers, and then the local newspapers picked up the story. So the international pressure was built, and so he went back and then did this on the 12th of August. in 2 days, he just flew back because there was some kind of a pushback from the international community to go back and sort out the flood crises. We saw a similar kind of thing in July 31st, 2022. There was a whole kind of hue and cry. I don't know if anybody knows about the political situation of Pakistan, but at that time, Imran Khan was giving headaches to this kind of political leadership. And so they were really not interested in the flood victims at the time. And so they were going and they were actually forced, when the international media started to really, flagged the story, only then we saw Shahbaz Sharif going there. And then I think they also utilized it to their favor, and they made it into much more of a leading the loss and damage debate, which in some levels makes some legitimate sense, but it angers people like me to say that, if this debate actually has some kind of, the most affected should be the one who should be benefiting for this loss and damage debate, which is happening in these comfortable, cushy corridors of power. And then, the kind of real picture is actually done very differently by the media. So there were some hopes and heroes in 2022. Social media was a big, we saw a lot of activism on social media, and a lot of pressure was done by social media. Great footage came, and so these victims were given a lot of coverage on social media. International media covered the story much better this time. This was Al Jazeera during floods, BBC Urdu series on floods in Pakistan, and the local television channels. They acted as social workers the journalists acted as social workers to the communities and international media, providing them with boats, acting as interpreters, carrying medicines and distributing food packages, along with reporting on the devastation. Because they were from the community, local reporters were from the communities themselves, so they felt much more devastated by the situation, because their own families were just suffering as much as anybody else. But that was not the case in Islamabad and Karachi and anywhere. So not much learned in 12 years. So why did the Pakistani media why is it covering, what is it covering? I mean, I was like, why are they not, what are the real issues that the Pakistani media should be reporting on the flood coverage? And to my knowledge, I mean, there are the reasons that I think is that they are not mentioning the glacial melt, which is happening in the Himalayas, the illegal encroachments and buildings on the side of the rivers, flawed bridges, unbuilt and unfinished mini dams, outdated drainage systems, course of freshwater streams changed into leveraged water supplies to feudal crops, especially in Sindh. And it doesn't cover these stories well or enough. And this is humanitarian crises at the best level, and this is not exclusive to Pakistan. It's happening in India, it's happening in Sri Lanka, and it's happening in Bangladesh. And this is the most climately, acutely, it's the most populous region in the world. And the climate crisis is acute in South Asia, as we all know, with heat waves going here and there, and flash floods and droughts, and obviously smog. And that's not just exclusive to South Asia. We have it in Italy as well, and everywhere, I think. I had offered 2 strategies on how the media can help manage floods in this case. Then my short-term strategy says that we need to have capacity building of not only, I mean, if anybody wants to support on an international level these communities, I think the local communities have to be engaged and with kind of in structural building of how to really provide relief measures and restoration, and then also long-term strategy, because in the global north it's easy to just assume that people are know about, or they have the kind of sense of all this, but in these countries, I mean, it has to be part of the kind of a national discourse. Education has to be on climate policy or climate crisis has to be on a national level. And I'm going to conclude my presentation with a work which is very, which is, I think, very influential if I understand how these communities have to be provided a voice in the mainstream kind of a discussion on how to improve or deal with climate crisis and climate change. And this is a book which is like Who Speaks for the Climate by M.T. Boykoff. He stresses the importance of climate change narratives based on the experience of climate vulnerable communities. And according to Boykoff, critical articulation of the notion of the involvement of the most affected communities are important in media narratives around these effective communities. In order to, if his notion is applied to the case of media reporting of mass floods in Pakistan, it is evident that the policymakers, stakeholders, and media have failed to create an effective, necessary, and preventive climate change media narrative after the massive floods which hit the country in 2010, because the same climatic devastation returned on a mammoth scale, creating far more destruction in 2022. No lessons had been learned. Similar mistakes have been repeated not only in Pakistan, but in communities in the global south, primarily because the local affected voice is not communicated well or enough. If climate risk communities are not brought into center stage for the future of the climate change discussion, for decision making and global action, this debate is unlikely to achieve feasible, effective outcomes. Global and local media can and should play a critical role. Thank you very much.
Thank you a lot, Kira-san, for raising this important issue. I mean, the role of the media, not just academics, lawyers, practitioners, etc., but the media are crucial in transforming facts into news that can be communicated and make a difference. News from South Sudan? Okay, nothing. So we proceed. Hopefully, Alexander will arrive. I hope there is nothing, brave. So the next speaker is Corrado Mandrioli. As I said, he's the vice president of this NGO, Rescue, that was established a few years ago, actually, to respond to some policies that the Italian government adopted in the field of migration. Corrado will make his presentation in Italian. Sofia, thank you, Sofia, will provide a translation into English, and he will start with a couple of videos that depict what his organization is doing in the Mediterranean Sea. Thank you.
Morning. Sorry, my English is ridiculous. I prefer to speak in Italian. Sofia, translate. Thank you, Sofia. Bene, ho preferito iniziare con queste immagini per dire che cosa succede nel Mediterraneo. Nel Mediterraneo quotidianamente ci sono persone che rischiano la vita per inseguire un sogno o per fuggire dai conflitti, dalla repressione, e ci sono ONG che cercano di salvarle.
So I decided to start out with this video to show what is happening in the Mediterranean. Every day in the Mediterranean, there are people that are escaping and traveling to find a better life, and at the same time, there are NGOs that are working to save those people.
Dall'altra parte c'è in questo caso la Guardia Costiera libica, ma vale anche per la Guardia Costiera della Tunisia, che intercettano persone che attraversano il Mar Mediterraneo scappando dai centri di detenzione, scappando dalle torture, dopo aver pagato quel viaggio migliaia di euro, e vengono catturati e riportati alla casella di partenza nei centri di detenzione, con una differenza: che non hanno più le risorse per riprendere quel viaggio.
So on the other side, there is the coastal guard. Usually they're both from Libya and Tunisia. In the video, it was the Libyan coastal guard. And they capture those people that are escaping from detention, also from detention in Libya. And after those people have managed to escape Libya and the tortures that they sustain in Libya, and after having paid huge amounts of money to escape, they are captured and brought back to Libya, to the starting point. And once back in Libya, they are put back into the system they were escaping, and they are without the resources that they had at the beginning of their trip.
E cos'è la cosa assurda, incredibile alla quale siamo arrivati? Che chi salva le vite umane è criminalizzato, è osteggiato, è denigrato come amico dei trafficanti di uomini. Chi invece cattura le persone e le riporta dai centri di detenzione, di tortura, è sostenuto dal nostro governo, ma purtroppo da tanti governi.
Mm-hmm. And you know what's the absurd thing in all of this? Is that those that are saving lives are opposed, antagonized, criminalized, referred as friends of the smugglers. Meanwhile, those that are bringing the people back to the detention centers, so the coastal guard, they are supported and financed by our government and also other foreign governments.
E tutto questo mentre le nostre costituzioni, la Carta dei diritti internazionali, ci vincola a porre la questione della tutela dei diritti e delle persone al centro delle nostre azioni. Paradossalmente se non presti soccorso per la legge sei condannabile.
And this is all happening while our constitutions, the Human Rights Charter and our protection instruments are promoting the protection of rights, and it's a paradox, but if you don't save lives, you are committing a crime as well.
Come si è potuti arrivare a un ribaltamento di questa situazione? E questo è il tema che è stato discusso anche in questi giorni. C'è stata una propaganda, una narrazione continua in questi anni che, complice la situazione di crisi economica e sociale, ha portato l'opinione pubblica ad avere paura per come era descritto questo fenomeno e ha sostenuto i portatori di una tesi che voleva che il nostro paese si chiudesse su se stesso rispetto al pericolo che arrivava da fuori, individuato nei migranti.
So how did we get here in this kind of reversed situation? It all comes from a narrative that was also fueled by a period of intense economic and social crisis, where the public opinion was led to believe that the fear is the response, and it allowed those that support the thesis saying that closure and fear are the way to go.
E quindi salto molti passaggi, ma penso che la sala sia in grado di svilupparli. Mi concentro su quello che come ONG abbiamo deciso di fare.
So I'm skipping a lot of steps, but I believe that you are able to follow me. And I want to focus on what our NGO is doing.
Noi abbiamo due obiettivi. Il primo è fare qualcosa di concreto, uscire da una fase, come dire, di vergogna, di immobilismo e di fare qualcosa concretamente per salvare le persone che rischiano di morire.
So the first thing is that we want to do something concrete. We want to move out of this moment of shame and immobility and do something concrete to save the lives of those people.
Ma questo da solo non ci basta. Noi vogliamo lavorare perché un domani non ci sia più bisogno di noi. Vogliamo lavorare perché nel Mediterraneo ci sia il nostro paese, come c'è stato in passato con la missione Mare Nostrum, ma ancor di più sogniamo un futuro dove le persone possano muoversi senza rischiare la vita.
But this alone, saving people, is not enough. We want to create a world where tomorrow we will not be needed anymore. and a Mediterranean where our country is back as it used to be with the Mare Nostrum mission. But also we want to create a world where people can travel safely and reach their desired destinations in a safe and secure way.
Per fare questo, però, per far sì che il nostro paese torni a svolgere una funzione che sostenga la nostra Costituzione, il lavoro che dobbiamo fare è un lavoro che si rivolga alle persone nelle nostre comunità per fare una narrazione che sia assolutamente opposta a quella che ci è stata propinata in tutti questi anni. Cioè noi dobbiamo usare la pratica quotidiana dell'essere in mare a salvare persone, a raccogliere storie, a leggere da dove arrivano le persone, perché arrivano le persone, usare questa pratica per sensibilizzare le nostre comunità che c'è un'idea diversa di affrontare i temi dell'immigrazione.
So to bring back our country to the constitution standards, we want to talk to the people, talk to our community, and reverse the current narrative, and to bring within our communities our daily work that is saving lives, but is also hearing the stories, telling the stories of those people that we hear every time we save them, and to raise awareness in our communities and to bring back this story within our lives, daily lives.
Le nostre immagini, le nostre storie, ma questo vale anche per i temi trattati ieri. La catastrofe alla quale noi ci stiamo apprestando dal punto di vista ecologico, ma il disastro che le guerre stanno provocando in questo periodo, cioè siamo sull'orlo di una catastrofe e la nostra vita quotidiana scorre, come dire, tranquillamente. Il tema è che abbiamo bisogno di ricostruire un tessuto di relazioni perché sia possibile, attraverso, come dire, queste esperienze, trasferire una sensibilità che ricrei nelle comunità appartenenza, identità e soprattutto che ritornino a svolgere un ruolo di partecipazione, perché senza questo tessuto, senza questa partecipazione, il nostro futuro è davvero, come dire, inesorabilmente destinato alla tragedia.
Right now, we are witnessing environmental disasters, wars, so we are basically at the edge of a catastrophe, and our lives are going on as usual. So we need to build back the social fabric and to recreate a belonging and an identity within our communities that is based on those things I was telling you earlier. Because without those ideals of belonging and identity, the future that we will be having is a tragedy.
E quindi essere in mare a salvare le persone, ma essere nei territori a creare comunità, con l'idea che una comunità accogliente, dove si rispettano i diritti di tutti, dove c'è accoglienza, è una comunità che è godibile per tutti, non solo per i soggetti più fragili. È una comunità dove è bello vivere. Mentre una comunità che è governata dall'odio, dalla solitudine, dalla indifferenza, è una comunità nella quale si vive male, ma viviamo male tutti, non solo i soggetti più fragili. E allora l'idea è proprio questa, di ricostruire il tessuto sociale usando tutti gli strumenti che abbiamo a disposizione, con l'idea di creare una comunità, un paese, una Europa all'insegna del rispetto dei diritti, dell'ambiente, ma in modo particolare della vita di tutti.
So it's both being the sea in the sea, saving lives, but also in the territory, building a community. This community would be good for all, because, you know, a community where rights and a welcoming attitude are promoted and fostered is a community where it's nice to live in for everyone, not just the vulnerable groups. On the other hand, a community that is based on hate, indifference, and fear is not a nice place to live in. So our objective is to recreate this social fabric that is based on these positive attitudes and to rebuild our community, our country, Europe, in a way that is respecting of the rights and lives of people.
Grazie per la pazienza. Volevo scusarmi con Sofia perché gli ho dato una traccia di cui non ho tenuto assolutamente conto e quindi ringrazio l'abilità di inseguirmi da parte di Sofia. Grazie ancora.
Thank you, Corrado. Thank you, Sofia. Yeah, I think that you put an important point. You made an important point. So how to make vulnerability not just a principle, an idea, a concept, but also a value, something to celebrate, something that is characterizing the life of everybody of us. So not sort of an obstacle to solidarity, to sharing, but a reason why we should participate even more. Again, is Alexander online? Good. So, welcome, Alexander. So
Thank you very
Alexander,
much.
yeah, I can't see you, but in a minute he will be with us. Thank you for joining. Alexander Rosinski is an officer now working for OCHA in South Sudan. He has been working also in Ukraine, from which he is also originary, and in Ethiopia. So he has, even if he's young, he has an important experience in the field. So also for you, the challenge is to articulate what is your approach to vulnerability and what is your experience with vulnerable people, vulnerable population. You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me well?
Yes, fine.
Excellent. So thanks a lot. My name is Alexander Rosinski, and I'm a Humanitarian Affairs Officer working for United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs since 2014, being based in Ukraine, Ethiopia, Somalia, and currently I'm speaking from South Sudan, based in Juba. So working mainly in the conflict zones, as you have heard, and natural disasters, which is a mandate of UN OCHA. We used to deal with the people in need. The humanitarian assistance and providing the humanitarian assistance. The humanitarian assistance is usually the type of the assistance which required for the survival, starting from the food, shelter, medicines, and other basic necessity items. So today I have a very short slot time to talk about the applied understanding of the vulnerability criteria using the examples from my work. So what is the vulnerability for humanitarians and why it's important? The humanitarian workers are responding to the needs of the people when the government don't have either capacity or access to the population due to the various reasons. Thus, within the 24 hours, for example, in case of the natural disaster, or after the understanding that the government don't have enough means to cope and to provide to their population, they call the United Nations and asking to step up and provide life-saving support. In order to imagine why do we need and how do we apply vulnerability criteria, let's imagine the zone of the conflict with the mass casualties. Let's say as the aftermath of the destructive shelling in specific area, we have more than 100 people in different conditions that require the emergency response and support. And you are coming to the scene as the medical worker, as a part of the emergency team. What do you need to do first? The first thing is you need to do is a triage. Triage is the system which is used by the individuals and aim to determine specific groups of the patients that should receive treatment and care based on the clinical status, prognosis, disease, and other available resources which can be provided to them. So you'll be first going and checking whether the person is breathing, moving, maybe it's bleeding. And based on this, you would give them different colors. From the green, when the person is moving and absolutely is fine, to yellow, orange, and red. Some of them would be black. But we are speaking of those who are alive, and we have to prioritize somehow the assistance and the resources that we have at this moment of time. Speaking again from the experience in all the countries, I have to say that there are never enough resources. It's not only about the money, it's also about the human power. This is about the assistance. This is about the access. So in any case, after the evaluation of the needs, we have to understand who are the people that need the most. So here comes the vulnerability criteria. It aims just to identify who should receive it first, who second, and then if we have more, we can cover the rest. So the definition of the vulnerability criteria can be described in the armed conflicts and humanitarian crisis as the increased risk and susceptibility of certain groups of people to harm, abuse, or deprivation due to the specific circumstances or characteristics. The heightened risks is often rises from the combination of different factors, including but not limited to their social status, to the economic conditions, health, age, gender, and ethnicity. Vulnerability is not something that is inherited, but rather a product of unequal social and political, sometimes economical structures or situation that exacerbates by the impact of the crisis of certain group of the population. So who are these groups? I think you have heard a lot already about them, but to repeat, one of the first group would be children, and especially those who are unaccompanied children, orphans, or involved in the child labor or abuse. or labor for the armed forces, for example. Then, of course, women and girls who facing some additional risks of gender-based violence, exploitation, sexual exploitation in particular, health complications, and so on. Then we can speak about the elderly people who often have very limited mobility and access to the services or possibility to leave the area. Then disabled individuals who are also experience specific barriers accessing different emergency services. Then we can go to another group, which are internally displaced or just displaced people. Some of them we call refugees, some of them displaced people, depending whether they are crossing the boundary of the country or not. Of course, these are the people who are forced to flee due to the different factors, in this case, natural disaster or the conflict. And then there are ethnic and religious minorities, which are also can face targeted violence, discrimination, or marginalization. Speaking about the examples from my experience of Ukraine, for example. So in my case, the conflict started in 2014, as I'm coming from the east of Ukraine. And in the beginning, it started as rallies, but continued with the violence and with the use of the different kind of weaponry, starting from the small sum fire, but continued with the heavy weaponry. And the first reaction of the people is to move, of course, to save their lives, to save their loved ones, to save their children. So we faced a huge displacement of the population. Some of them went to the east, to the Russia. Some of them went to the west part of Ukraine and outside of Ukraine. So in this case, the vulnerable groups and the first one were displaced families. And they faced a number of different shocks and issues while being displaced. First of all, this is a question of the ability, the question of the shelter in the new place, the question of the livelihoods, the possibility just to sustain their families. Majority, of course, starting to move to their relatives, to some places where they know, the people that they know, and the areas where they can receive support from the host community. The second issues which we found when we started to work as a humanitarians, this is a large number of the elderly and disabled people who remained in the areas, especially in the zones of the active fights. And in the east of Ukraine, it was a large area of about 500 kilometers, which was the front line. And from the both sides of it, we had something about 500,000 people that live in that stretch. The second issue that the people faced is access to the healthcare, especially in the limited areas and beyond the government control side, where the people starting to experience lack of specific medicines. The first one is related to the diabetes and any other important drugs that were especially provided from the Western countries. And due to the closure of the front line and inability to deliver them, there was a specific group of the people, like people dependent on the diabetes issues, that faced a life-threatening situation. When we go to the example of the South Sudan, it's a bit different. And again, we are coming to the area of the conflict, but in addition to that, it's a complex emergency. Complex emergency means that we are experiencing also floods. In addition to the floods, for example, yesterday in around 9 o'clock in the evening, there was an earthquake, which was not that intense, so there were no destructions, but still we have seismic activity. In addition to all of these factors, there is a question of the poverty. And the poverty here has huge numbers. We're speaking about up to the 80% of the population that lives beyond the minimum level. With this, when you are coming as a humanitarian, there is a question, how do you prioritize? All the people are vulnerable, and all of them require support. But there are some of the systemic issues that needs to be addressed by the government, while others can be supported by the international community, and especially the emergency part of the response. So here we would speak about, again, the question of the internally displaced people. The number of the people that were moving from the South Sudan to Sudan and vice versa within the last 30 years counted in millions. Now we are having the serious deterioration of the security situation with the active conflict in Sudan. With this, we received since outbreak on 15th of April, more than 300,000 people who came from Sudan to South Sudan. And this is additional burden on the host community. But at the same time, they are the one that lack everything. So when you are coming with the one bag of the clothes and with a kid on the shoulder, you are in the position where you have no possibility to ask or to find a shelter, to cover your basic needs as a food, water. So humanitarians would be focusing on those who are facing life-threatening situation, and this group of the people became one of the number one. The second one will be the children in armed conflict. Due to the lot of military actions, poor infrastructure, the quite low level of the educational system, South Sudan has one of the highest number of the child soldiers in the world. Many of them are forcibly recruited into the armed groups, which deprive them from the possibility to have education and expose them to the extreme violence. The third group of the people that I would select is the women and girls who are at heightened risk of the gender-based violence and the sexual violence. Unfortunately, due to the, again, large number of the intercommunal fights, in addition to the one which the country experienced during the civil war after the recent establishment, and South Sudan is one of the youngest countries in the world, which was widely recognized and received independence in 2011. Still, even afterwards, they faced at least two big civil wars in 2013 and 2016. Then there was another conflict in 2018. All these conflicts, they are influencing and not allowing the community to develop and to make sure that the services, even basic services, are available to the wider population. So here we can speak about the different vulnerability, and these vulnerable groups, they are much wider, of course, than the one that I spoke about right now. But when we're speaking about the application of this vulnerability criteria, it's caused again by the lack of resources and need to focus, to streamline the response. The other different kind of vulnerability during the conflict zones can be the question of the access to the basic needs and services, which we can observe all over the country of South Sudan, for example. Then we have, of course, the psychological impact of the people who experience trauma or witnessing the violence, who lost their loved ones. And there are large groups of the people in South Sudan who went after the post-traumatic stress and disorder and anxiety, depression. The other part which I would like to also highlight is the question of the marginalization and discrimination. Due to the nature of the communities in South Sudan, they are very much linked to the ethnical dimension. With this, when one of the groups is leading the country, for example, is in the power, we can see that there are many other groups that are suppressed, or they're limited in their voting rights, limited in the access to the services, to the education, and even to the food. And the last one, which I would like to highlight, is the question of the exploitation by the armed groups. In the conflict zones, we can see that more and more people are limited in their possibilities of the livelihoods. And we can speak about both. The South Sudan, of course, is a very bright example, but in Ukraine, it was very similar. In the non-government or Russian-controlled part, any kind of business has ceased to exist at some point. Then, of course, it was a bit reinforced with the people coming from Russian side. But still, the large enterprises, the coal mines, the steel factories, and were providing work opportunities to millions of the people. Due to the active conflict and inability to sell the production, all these areas, all these companies, they have either stopped or very much reduced their activity. With this, we received huge amount of the people unemployed in the working age, but who had no means to sustain their families. So the employment by the army became one of the main options for the income. For both, again, it's very similar from the both sides of the contact line in Ukraine, but also, of course, when we look at the South Sudan and the situation there with the people that are surviving on the salaries, which is the official salary is something between $5 to $10 per month. So of course it's almost nothing, even taking into consideration the low levels of the foods and services. Still, it's less than bare minimum. So with this, I would like just to highlight that when we're speaking about the vulnerability criteria in the terms of the crisis, it's important to leave no one behind, especially those who cannot access services themselves and get the assistance. Because we can see in most of the areas, the most active people who are able to move and who have resources, they still continue to get more, while there are large groups of the people that either shy or they don't know, or they are limited, that in fact are facing the life-threatening situations. Thank you. Do you have any questions?
Thank you. Thank you, Alexander. It also is so important to look at this situation from the humanitarian viewpoint. That is not the viewpoint of political leaders, geopolitics, and so on, but it's so important, especially if we adopt the position of vulnerability as your standing point. Before opening the discussion to the audience, I would like to ask our panelists if they have maybe 1 minute to reply to what they heard from the other members of the panel, and or just complement what they just said. I will start with Anna. So 1 minute.
Well, I'm thinking about a an article of Judith Butler on the London Book Review of Book. This article is about Palestinian and Israel, but I'm thinking to this article because the title of this article is The Compass of Mourning. And one point about when we talk about vulnerability and people who are vulnerable, in this last period, I'm thinking also to this, to the impossibility to cry, to the impossibility to cry for their loves, to their impossibility to have a time for live the mourning. This is an inequality. I mean, when something happens, if we think about shipwreck of other type of people, of white people who lost their lives, and we think about media, we can see that we know more or less all about their lives, who they were, in which way they live, and we know all about their lives. But when Black people die, we know nothing about them. And this is really, I think, one of the most urgent political topic that we have to face also when we talk about vulnerability. And last things is, I'm a little bit discouraged, even due the last agreement with Albania. So I'm a little bit, so I'm thinking if sometimes we say we lost our tradition of human rights defender, Europe is the country of human rights, but I'm not so sure that we are. And so we have again, in most of cases, the system, not we, but the system have again a colonialist approach. So this is my remarks.
Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are a number of threads that sort of run through all the interventions that were that we just listened to, and I think, I mean, one of them is obviously what is our positionality, whether we are academics, whether we are lawyers, whether we are media specialists. You know, what's our positionality in relation to the you know, to vulnerable communities and individuals. There's also, I think, another common thread that I think sort of emerged throughout all the presentations was, where are the voices of the communities and the individuals that are considered vulnerable? So there's a I think a proactive attempt by certain institutions, state institutions, media outlets, to invisibilize certain stories. Because what is not known generates fear, and that leads to rejection, it leads to incomplete action. But I also think that there are some hopeful points. So first of all, the idea, I think, of interdependency, how there is a common humanity that sort of connects all of us. And the other one, this attempt, which I think comes across all the intervention, to approach these themes with you know, with an ethics of care, I guess. So yeah, that's my reflections.
All my Sorry. You are a media expert.
I think that the choice of this panel has been very carefully constructed, and I must admire people who have actually chosen the presentations, not myself, but others. Because we had to discuss some very important dimensions on human rights in the NGOs, legal community, legal media, and academia, and UN. We had representatives from all sectors, and we were talking about narratives. I think that is, as a person of communication, understanding communication, I think we all are struggling for some kind of another approach for narration. I think that was a kind of cross-cutting theme, and it's an indexical moment which we all, as panelists, we have come to, and a kind of like understanding that we have a problem in the narration of how we don't have a voice, and our voices are losing. So that's my point. Thank you.
Thank you.
Sarò breve. Penso che uno degli aspetti importanti, visto che siamo in campo accademico, è come nei processi e nei percorsi curriculari, sia per quanto riguarda la ricerca, sia per quanto riguarda l'aspetto accademico in legge, eccetera, si creino nei percorsi delle opportunità per fare esperienza di divulgazione. Noi abbiamo fatto un accordo con la Normale di Pisa.
He's stressing the point that it's important to include these topics in the curricula of universities, for example, and so that these issues can be, let's say, shared with students and disseminated in the broader society.
Perché il tema della sensibilizzazione ha bisogno di un percorso esperienziale.
Sensitization needs some experience, some concrete, handoff.
Ed è utile a tutti. Abbiamo fatto un accordo con la Normale di Pisa, dove alcuni studenti sono venuti in missione.
So Rescue has an agreement with the Normale University in Pisa, so some students joined the operators of Rescue in the mission.
Perché è un completamento curricolare che fa bene a noi, perché trova le risorse anche per aiutarci ad essere più efficaci nella sensibilizzazione e nella comunicazione.
This also helps to have the students around, let's say, helps the NGO to be more effective in communication, in the dissemination of what they do, etc.
Come Rescue, insieme ad altre associazioni a Trieste, intercettiamo le persone che arrivano dalla rotta balcanica.
Rescue, together with other organizations, also operates in Trieste. People comes from the Balkan route.
E un'esperienza di contatto, di rapporto con chi percorre la rotta balcanica è un incredibile aumento di esperienza e produce idee, sensibilità da riprodurre in tutti gli ambiti.
And then, meeting and reaching out and talking with these people coming from the Balkan routes is important to continue their activities of reaching out, of spreading information and making sensitization. You learn a lot by meeting these persons and talking with them, etc. Alexander, any comments?
Thank you, Professor. I would say that when we are working and we are studying and working for academia, it's very important to make sure that everything that we understood and worked on can be applied in the reality. So in my case, I would say that the study in Padova University helped a lot to understand better the concepts, but then there is a question, how do we apply? Is it applicable in this or that situation? So to use the lens of the applicability. Thank you very much. It's important.
Thank you. Now we have, officially, I think 7 minutes for the general discussion. I think we can extend, since we start a little later, extend this session to, let's say, 5 past. Okay. So if there is questions for the panels or comments that you may want to make, remarks, Sabayeta, I see. I think the rule is that you have to come here and speak at the microphone. Is a way of avoiding to have many questions. Please.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Sabaita Zanelli. I'm a first-year master student of Human Rights and Multi-Level Governance. First of all, thank you all for your very valuable and insightful contributions. It was really interesting. Now my question is about what Ms. Pramila already mentioned, the latest agreement of Albania and Italy regarding the refugee shelters to be built in Albania. I come from Albania, so I'm kind of following the narrative in media in both countries to see how the people are perceiving it. And our Prime Minister is framing it to the media as, well, this is not going to solve anything. So he starts by saying that this doesn't solve anything, and then continues by, we owe it to Italy. So we have to accept, because, well, we went to Italy in the 90s massively, they accepted us, so now they're asking for something in favor. And I just wanted to ask for your opinion regarding this issue also from the legal point of view, because I know that international law has. Thank you.
Shall we perhaps take another question so you can be maybe shorter in the, yeah, 1 and 2. Okay, you have to push the bottom of the, yeah. No, yes, the red one.
Yeah, thank you. So I will be fast before Alexander is not gone, because my question goes to him. So I am also a master student here in multi-level governance, and basically right now 80% on what we do on our lessons with international policy is we do criticize United Nations. And everyone, I feel like right now, has lack of confidence. And we could even see this after, I think, what's happened in Kakhovska. A lot of Ukrainians also started criticize a lot of what's UN do, or what I can put it not do in that moment. And so my question would be, what do you think, as in a person who work inside the structure, can be done to really maintain the confidence people have in this institution? How can we improve the situation? Thank you.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Bernardo. I'm also a student from the Masters in Human Rights. My question is especially to Dr. Hassan. I hope I'm pronouncing correctly. It's concerning, you talked about the media coverage in Pakistan, but we're seeing a lot of things that are not covered by the media. And what can we as human rights defenders specifically do to bring out those stories? This morning I was watching the news here in Italy. They were talking about the situation in Gaza, but they were also talking about the situation in South Sudan, was a member from Doctors Without Borders. But what can we actually do if we're not the media? But what is our role in this? Thank you.
Hi, my name is Angwen. I'm a PhD student in here. I have I don't know, like 1 or 2 questions, maybe 1 question for Dr. Barisis and also for Alexandros, because like I think I find it's difficult to do a common ground between what we call practice in academia in research, because like I had a period of working with ENDP in ages before, and I did some research with them at the same time, but because my field is academic research, so I wanted to publish it in academia research about practical things with UNDP. So the problem with me in academia research publishing is that it takes very long time for a paper to be published. And the rule is that you have to do original work, and it cannot be anywhere else before it was published in academia. So my paper was finished from last year in March about like women peace building with a lot of interviews. And when I was working with UNDP, we have to talk about that one can be used as a way for them to form the next year, the following year, policies about women peace building and digital skills. The point is that until today, the paper was still not published and still in processing for I don't know how long anymore. So the plan goes from last year and cannot do it until this year, and I don't know when. And when it will show up, it will be too late for the policy to maybe be practical anymore. So I don't know if someone working with UN and someone is working about practical human rights can find a way for we to have a common ground and what could be a solution for this one. Because I think that practical in human rights is important for us to not terrorist and practical research. But the problem is working with policies and academic research is that the point when you have the something to show for other people, it will be too late and too outdated. Even like in my research right now, I'm doing about digital platform policies. And most of the research published in 2023 is about policy of 2 years ago in 2021 is the newest one I could find. And the policy of Facebook, for example, from 2021 were already changed around 7 to 10 times until today. So it was very outdated and there was no point in seeing what they had 2 years ago anymore. So how could we balance this? Because it's a very vulnerable stuff that we are talking about in human rights and everything. Thank you.
Hello, good morning. My question is for Conrado. Professor, can you translate for him? Because unfortunately I cannot
Conrado, your
speak
question
Italian
is for you.
yet. No, it's just a practical question from the point of view of your NGO, because you mentioned that sometimes your people, the humanitarian workers working with refugees in the Mediterranean, they are prosecuted because they're helping lives, basically. They like rescue people from boats. They're probably going to die if they don't receive any help. And many times I've seen that like activists and other humanitarian works, they are prosecuted even for human trafficking just because they are offering help. So my question is, because I do intend to work with this one day, if I help someone from a boat, am I going to be prosecuted as a human trafficker? Or your organization, your NGO have received many claims, many judicial process about that already? Did you win? Did you win those cases? It's just a question. Thank you.
Diciamo, rischiano qualche processo, insomma, o addirittura di essere confuse con i trafficanti, se c'è qualche forma di protezione, insomma, che avete in mente, visto che lei vuole lavorare in quel settore. Ok.
Rispondo subito.
Yeah.
Abbiamo una grande pattuglia di avvocati dell'ASGI che sono una garanzia tra i migliori.
So the best lawyers are at their disposal, in case. But still, yeah, is an issue in Italy, and not only in Italy. The last question, and then, well, there should be also some answers, no? Yeah.
Well, thank you for your presentations. I had one question regarding the position of academics. You mentioned that we had to position ourselves because defending human rights demands some sort of political positioning. But at the same time, when you are a scholar, you are requested some sort of neutrality and impartiality in science. So how do we balance this issue of committing to an issue that is in a way political without sacrificing the credibility of an academic publication? Thank you.
Okay. There is questions online? No, okay, no. Sorry. We have 5 minutes maybe to answer the questions briefly. Is a challenge. Maybe you can start, yes.
Okay, sorry. I will. I have a few minutes, so I try to focus on some point. The first is for what Albania has to be grateful. for Kateri Radesh, for the shipwreck of Kateri Radesh, or for the way in which we welcome Albanian in the Stadium of Bari, for this. And second point, okay, we say that Italy welcome Albanian people and Albanian migrants, but here the point is that Albania give a support to Italy to exclude migrant people from protection. This is the point. Repatriation procedure, fast asylum procedure, it's not a way to integrate people, it's a way to exclude them. And final point, that what I have fair is that it's clear that there is a long-term plan. Because before to publish this agreement with Italy, with Albania, and I finish here, Italy the government decided to use military rules to give a legal support to accommodation center. So in this way, they are trying to exclude also the control of the Italian parliament on this agreement. So I think that this is really worried. Maybe we can take time after. Thank you.
Questions also for Giuseppe, I think.
Yeah, I think there are probably two questions I can try to offer a few thoughts on. The first one was, if I'm not mistaken, Ang's question about the, I think, how can you, I guess if I'm trying to sort of summarize it, it was how can you influence policy circles as an academic if it takes so long to publish, essentially. And I think, I mean, I don't think there is a fast answer to this. What I would say is that maybe, so once you're aware basically of the power that academic publishers hold, I think you have to basically think about what your priorities are. What do you want to achieve with whatever you've written? Are you trying to really influence somebody, or can that wait and maybe, I don't know, make a choice? I know it's not like a definite answer, but I don't know, that's the only way I can think about that. And I mean, obviously more systemically, I think we should try to push the publishing market to use probably different metrics and ways of working. On the question that, sorry, you didn't say your name, Carlos asked. Well, I mean, honestly, I think that when we're talking about human rights, we have to acknowledge that human rights are political. I don't know why there is such a big, how can I say, such a big sort of, why that's a taboo. But I think human rights are political, are part of a political project. And so I think when you work as an academic, when you're writing, I think as long as you acknowledge your positionality and as long as you endorse in a sort of reasoned manner where human rights stand, this political dimension of human rights, for me, it should be enough. But I know that it doesn't always work like that. Sorry.
Kira.
How can human rights people, shape the media narratives is actually by criticizing the corrupt corporate media, which goes hand in hand with the political power brokers, the capitalist media. That's one. And that is actually ballooning to out of proportions now that we live in a world of social media. We need much more kind of human rights activism, studies, critical studies, areas, platforms where we condemn all these big tech giants who are holding too much power over narratives and who are going to have a very different approach in looking at digital, freedom of expression rights. I don't know where we are going to be when everybody is in Twitter universe, Twitter X, metaverse universe, and we are giving big data to a lot of unaccountable governments and platforms. So it's a very, very different space that we are working in, but it needs much more acute recognition and solution, which doesn't have to be, I think some disciplines have a very different approach than, I mean, if it's a history academic journal, then it probably would require like 2 years or 3 years of like that kind of process. But if somebody is submitting an article on how Twitter is the transformation from Twitter to X, and looking at it in some kind of regional context, some kind of timeline has to be reduced. Thank you.
Alexander, there were some questions for you. Yeah, I didn't mention it, but you
Thank
did it actually. That you spent some time also in our university studying our master. So that's something we are proud of.
Correct. Thank you. Thank you very much. So 2 questions were asked. The first one is the situation in Ukraine and the critics of the UN system in general. I think it's important to understand that all international organizations are working within their mandates. And if you want to judge the organization, first of all, you need to understand what part of it and what it's supposed to do. So you cannot judge the fish, how it's climbing the tree and comparing to the monkey. With this, in Ukraine currently we have only the humanitarian response and organizations and the part of the UN system which is aimed at the provision of the life-saving assistance to the conflict-affected population. With this, the question of any kind of judgment or fighting those who are responsible for different actions is not the mandate of the UN there. At the same time, I think that the UN is lacking good communication, an explanation of what is doing, whom supporting, how supports, and what is the aim of specific agencies that are activated in different countries. The same, for example, is in South Sudan, where we have, but here we have also development partners, and we have the political mission, we have peacekeeping mission. So here, when we have the peacekeeping, we can address the specific questions with regards to the loss of life or the responsibility to protect the population, especially when we're thinking about the different ethnic groups that are fighting among each other. So with this, I would say that we need to understand what the system is aimed, what the aims are standing in front of the organization in a specific country. But also, of course, we have a lot of limits from government. Even if we are willing to say and to speak and to describe, it's not always permitted, or the political part is limiting us in different ways. And it's done from both sides of the conflict. The second question was about the academia and the linkage between the publications on for example, the Women Peace Building and the timeliness of the documents to be submitted and open. I'm not sure about what kind of engagement you had or the contract with UNDP. UNDP definitely is a big organization, and the bigger it is, the slower it is. So definitely the question of the timely response is an issue. But at the same time, I'm sure that this linkage is absolutely vital. And for example, OCHA is organizing the Humanitarian Network and Partnership Week every year during the last, I think, 5 years or more in Geneva, where there is a possibility to meet between the academia and humanitarian professionals that are operational in the emergency settings, and where they can share. In addition to that, there are different parts of the UN bodies and specific committees which are looking into the use of the modern technologies. So if you're speaking about the digital things, sorry, I don't remember what was exactly what you were describing, but there some digital approach which is evolving every day and it's changing. The day tomorrow and the day after, the information is outdated. The issues that I can see is the question of the information which is available and use of this information by the international organizations. And it's easier with the smaller NGOs, but it's much harder with the big system like UN, because it's very much regulated like any government. And this, I think, should be addressed and should be voiced. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Alexander. I think we are to close these 2 days of conference. I start by saying thanks to the panel of this morning. The panel has been, I told you that it was a wonderful panel. It is actually a wonderful panel. But I remember also the speaker of yesterday in the morning. Some of them are still here. Some of them also will participate in the winter school that we started this afternoon, actually, again about vulnerability. So it's a way to continue this conversation that we started in these 2 days. I thank all the presenters who were in the panels of yesterday afternoon. I couldn't participate in that, but I had heard that they were extremely interesting, and there was a variety of issues raised that expanded this discussion about vulnerability, touching different points, and hopefully presenting new angles and new perspectives on this topic, which remains an important topic for our perspective of human rights, let's say, scholars, activists, and so on. And a big thank to all those who made possible to organize this conference, the administrative and technical staff of the Human Rights Center, the people here that are, taking pictures and recording what he has said. Pictures and other materials will be made available in the website of the Human Rights Center, and of course also our guests will receive access to pictures that depict them. The best picture will be also made at your disposal for disseminating, what we have done in these 2 days. Thanks also to the audience, and I hope you have appreciated the content and the way it has been served to you. Thanks a lot, and have a good time.
Thanks, everyone.